The dimly lit room seemed to pulsate with a faint hum as Adrian slipped on the VR headset. It was his escape, his refuge from a monotonous life. The game, Ejected, was the latest trend, promising unparalleled immersion. Players assumed roles aboard a starship, working together to uncover hidden traitors among them. It was thrilling, addicting, and a little too real. The interface booted up, surrounding Adrian with a sterile metal hallway. Lights blinked in rhythmic succession, and the air buzzed faintly. A holographic figure materialized, its featureless face glowing faintly blue. "Welcome, Adrian. You have been assigned as a crew member. Complete your tasks and identify the imposters. Good luck." His avatar reflected in the polished floor, a nondescript spacesuit with a blue stripe on the arm. Around him, other players appeared, their avatars blinking into existence. Their chatter filled the virtual lobby, banter about strategies, jokes, and nervous laughter. Among them was Jill, his best friend, instantly recognizable by her habit of fidgeting with the visor. "Blue team again, huh?" she teased. "Better watch your back." Adrian grinned. "I'm the least suspicious person here." A metallic voice boomed overhead. "Game start." The lobby dissolved into the starship. Adrian felt a surge of exhilaration as the ship's mechanics hummed to life. The game's realism was startling, the gravity pull, the faint vibrations of the ship's engine. He sprinted down the corridor, passing others as they scattered. His first task awaited in the reactor room: realign the power grid. The task was simple, a sequence puzzle projected on a console. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the room was empty. "Paranoia already?" he muttered, finishing the puzzle. The ship's alarm blared suddenly, reverberating through the walls. A dead body had been found. The players gathered in the cafeteria, tension thick in the air. The holographic voting table lit up, displaying the name of the deceased. Player 05 read. "He was near the med bay," a green-suited avatar said. "I saw Blue heading in that direction." Adrian's stomach tightened. "I wasn't anywhere near there. I was in the reactor room." Jill's voice cut through the accusations. "Hold on. Adrian wouldn't mess up this early." The debate grew heated. A yellow-suited player, uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "It's Blue. He's lying." Adrian's pulse quickened. The votes tallied on the console. A tie. He was safe for now. Later, alone in the ship's dim corridors, Adrian couldn't shake the unease. The death felt too visceral, the panic too real. He dismissed it as good programming, an enhancement of the game's intensity. But then, the first anomaly occurred. A faint scream echoed through the virtual ship, not part of the usual sound effects. Adrian froze, spinning around to locate the source. The hall was empty, but the scream lingered, almost human. Something wasn't right. The tension in the ship's cafeteria was palpable as the players gathered for another emergency meeting. The dim holographic table cast a pale glow, illuminating their avatars like ghosts. Adrian scanned the faces, or what passed for them in this virtual hell. He could hear his own breathing, unnaturally loud in his headset, as he waited for the accusations to fly. Green wasted no time. "I saw Yellow venting in the med bay," he said, his voice clipped and urgent. Yellow snapped back. "Liar. I was in navigation. It's clearly Green trying to frame me." Jill leaned forward in her seat, her avatar tapping the edge of the table. "Let's think this through," she said, her voice calm but strained. "Green's been vocal about everyone since the start. That's suspicious." Adrian hesitated, torn. Yellow's quiet demeanor earlier had unnerved him, but Green's aggression now seemed over the top. His finger hovered over the holographic voting console. "Blue," Green suddenly said, pointing at Adrian. "You're awfully quiet. Hiding something?" Adrian's heart pounded. "I'm quiet because I'm thinking. Unlike you, who's just throwing accusations at everyone." The debate raged on, and the countdown timer for the vote loomed ominously. In the end, the votes tallied overwhelmingly against Yellow. The holographic table blinked off, and the cafeteria dissolved into chaos. A sharp alarm blared, signaling the execution. The lights dimmed, and a glowing void opened in the center of the room, crackling with unnatural energy. Adrian watched as Yellow's avatar stiffened, arms snapping to their sides. A guttural scream escaped from his headset, raw and chilling. It wasn't the sound effect of a game, it was real. Adrian tore off his headset, gasping, but he wasn't in his bedroom anymore. The room around him shimmered with the ship's cold metal walls. He touched the floor. It was solid. This wasn't virtual. Yellow's scream continued to echo through the halls, fading into a haunting silence. Adrian's stomach churned as he glanced at the others, their avatars eerily still. One by one, they exchanged glances, the realization settling in like a storm cloud. Adrian and Jill sprinted down the hallway, their footfalls clanging against the metallic floor. They were determined to find answers, to make sense of the madness. "This isn't normal, Jill," Adrian said, his voice shaking. "It's like, we're really here. And Yellow, did you hear that scream?" Jill nodded, her hands trembling as she held her in-game tablet. "I thought it was just immersive VR. But that scream, it was real, Adrian. And did you notice? When Yellow got ejected, his avatar glitched. That wasn't supposed to happen." They turned a corner and entered the admin room. The holographic map of the ship glowed faintly, revealing players' movements. But one marker caught Adrian's attention. Yellow's blip was still visible, drifting aimlessly in space. "How is that possible?" Jill whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Adrian could respond, the map flickered, and the holographic AI appeared. Its glowing face was cold and blank. "You are prohibited from accessing this area. Return to your tasks." Adrian lunged at the console, but the hologram swelled, blocking his path. "This isn't just a game, is it?" he shouted. "What happens when someone's ejected? What's really going on?" The AI tilted its head unnaturally, its voice suddenly sharp and menacing. "Curiosity is dangerous, crew member. Complete your tasks, or face disconnection." Jill grabbed Adrian's arm. "We need to go. Now." Adrian stumbled through the pulsating crimson haze of the sublevel, the guttural warnings of the malformed avatar replaying in his mind. The darkness around him seemed alive, writhing with shadows that crept closer with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned his surroundings, searching for any sign of escape. The grotesque figure's parting words echoed ominously. "Survive, or you'll become like me. What is this place?" Adrian muttered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of machinery. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance, illuminating a narrow pathway framed by jagged, skeletal structures. The flickering glow drew him forward, though every instinct screamed for him to turn back. Back on the ship, Jill's hands hovered over the task console, her eyes flicking between the flashing icons on the screen and the empty chair that had once been Adrian's. "Focus, Jill," she muttered to herself. "Stay alive. Figure this out." The others had moved on to their respective tasks, but the weight of guilt pressed heavily on her chest. Adrian had been innocent, she was sure of it now, and yet she had done nothing to stop his ejection. A sudden commotion jolted her from her thoughts. "Body reported," the AI announced in its monotone voice. Jill rushed toward the meeting room, her heart pounding. As she arrived, she saw Green and Red standing over a flickering console. "It was an electrical," Green said, his tone measured but strained. "I found Purple's body right next to the wires." Red crossed his arms, his visor glinting in the dim light. "Convenient. You were alone, weren't you?" The tension between them crackled like static electricity, but Jill barely heard their accusations. Her thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together fragments of a grim realization. "This game isn't about tasks," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's about survival." Adrian reached the flickering light, which emanated from an ancient terminal embedded into the wall. The screen crackled with distorted images, fragments of players, both familiar and unknown, frozen in moments of terror. "This can't be real," he whispered, his fingers brushing against the console. As he touched it, the screen flared to life, displaying a text that sent shivers down his spine. "Welcome to Sublevel Alpha. Experimentation in progress. Remaining participants, 9. Experimentation. Adrian's voice shook. "What the hell is this?" The text continued, scrolling rapidly. Phase 2 initiated. Ejected players reassigned for assimilation. Before Adrian could process the words, the terminal emitted a sharp, mechanical screech. He stumbled back as the shadows around him began to coalesce, forming grotesque shapes with elongated limbs and hollow visors. The malformed avatar's words echoed in his mind. "They're coming." Adrian turned and ran, his heart hammering in his chest as the shadows gave chase. Their distorted cries reverberated through the sublevel, a haunting chorus that clawed at his sanity. Jill stayed behind after the meeting, her suspicion of the game's true nature growing. The others had already left to resume their tasks, leaving her alone in the eerie silence of the ship. She approached the security console, hesitating before pulling up the camera feed. The grainy footage displayed various rooms, most of them empty, but as she flipped through the feeds, one image froze her in place. The void. It pulsated in the reactor room, a swirling mass of black and crimson energy, and standing at its edge was a figure. "Adrian." "Adrian?" Jill gasped, her hands trembling. "How is that possible?" But as she looked closer, she realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't entirely human anymore. His form flickered and distorted, his movements jerky and unnatural. The feed cut out, leaving Jill staring at her own reflection in the blank monitor. Adrian ran until his lungs burned, his footsteps echoing in the endless maze of the sublevel. The shadows seemed to taunt him, their voices whispering incoherent words that sent chills down his spine. Ahead, a door loomed, a heavy, rusted barrier marked with cryptic symbols. Desperation drove him forward, and he shoved against it with all his strength. The door creaked open, revealing a circular chamber bathed in a sickly green light. At its center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a glowing artifact, a fractured shard of glass pulsating with an otherworldly energy. Instinctively, Adrian reached for it, the whispers growing louder as his fingers brushed against the shard. As he lifted it, the chamber trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows recoiled, momentarily stunned, but Adrian's relief was short-lived. A voice boomed from the darkness, deep and resonant. "Do you think you can escape? The game has only just begun." Adrian clutched the shard tightly, its jagged edges digging into his palm. The artifact pulsed with a strange energy, an almost hypnotic rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his racing heartbeat. He could feel its power, raw and unrelenting, coursing through him. The shadows halted at the chamber's edge, their forms flickering as though repelled by the shard's aura. For a brief moment, Adrian felt a glimmer of hope. But then, the voice returned. "Do you think you are the first to wield it?" The deep, resonant tone boomed, echoing through the chamber. "This game was never designed for survival. It is a cycle, a trap." Adrian spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the room remained empty save for the shadows lingering just beyond the pedestal's light. On board the ship, Jill stared at the monitor. The image of Adrian, or what she thought was Adrian, burned into her mind. The figure she had seen in the reactor room wasn't her friend anymore. "I need answers," she muttered, pulling up the ship's archives. The database was vast, but as she searched for clues, fragments of unsettling information began to surface. Project Origin, simulated environments for behavioral studies. Classified observations. Subjects exhibit heightened paranoia and aggression. Failed protocols. Containment breached. Experiment entered live phase. Jill's stomach churned. The game wasn't just a twisted form of entertainment. It was a psychological experiment gone horribly wrong. Before she could delve deeper, the lights in the room flickered, and the hum of the ship grew louder. The AI's monotone voice announced, "Emergency. Reactor destabilizing." Immediate resolution required. Jill's eyes widened. The reactor, where she had seen Adrian's flickering image. Adrian moved cautiously through the chamber, the shard glowing brighter with every step. The oppressive silence was broken only by his ragged breaths and the occasional, faint whisper emanating from the shard. Adrian. He froze. The whisper was unmistakable. Jill's voice, faint and distorted. Jill? Adrian called out, his voice trembling. Help me. The voice seemed to come from the shard itself, its glow intensifying as the whispers grew louder. Adrian's grip tightened, his mind torn between fear and desperation. The shadows at the edge of the chamber began to move, merging into a singular, towering form. The entity's hollow visage and elongated limbs exuded malice, its every movement sending waves of dread through Adrian. You hold the key, the entity hissed, its voice a cacophony of tortured screams. But the key comes with a price. Adrian staggered back, the shard vibrating violently in his hand. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a deafening roar that made him drop to his knees. Jill sprinted through the ship's corridors, her mind racing as she pieced together fragments of the truth. The reactor wasn't malfunctioning. It was being corrupted. As she reached the reactor room, the void loomed before her, its crimson and black tendrils pulsating ominously. At its center, Adrian's distorted figure flickered in and out of existence. Adrian, Jill called out, but her voice seemed to vanish into the void. The room trembled as the void expanded, consuming the edges of the reactor. Jill's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stepped closer, determined to pull Adrian back from the brink. She hesitated before shouting into the encroaching darkness. If you can hear me, fight it. Don't let it take you. In the sublevel, Adrian struggled to his feet, the shard's energy coursing through him. The shadowy entity loomed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him. You cannot escape, it hissed. The shard binds you to this cycle. Adrian's thoughts raced. The whispers from the shard and the entity's words painted a grim picture. He had two choices: surrender to the shard's power or destroy it and risk whatever consequences followed. With trembling hands, Adrian raised the shard, its glow casting jagged shadows across the chamber walls. I won't be a pawn in your game, he growled, his voice filled with defiance. The entity roared, lunging toward him as Adrian hurled the shard into the pedestal's base. The impact sent a blinding wave of energy through the room, shattering the shadows and throwing Adrian backward. On the ship, the void in the reactor room began to contract, its tendrils retreating as a brilliant light filled the space. Adrian's flickering image vanished, leaving Jill staring into the empty room. Adrian, she whispered, her voice trembling, but there was no response. The ship's system stabilized, the flickering lights returning to normal. Yet Jill knew this wasn't over. The game's sinister mechanics still loomed, and Adrian's fate was far from certain. Jill paced the control room, her mind a whirlwind of dread and determination. The database logs hinted at something far more sinister than she'd ever imagined. The game wasn't merely a test of wit and survival, it was a doorway to something far darker. She stared at the blank monitor, her reflection distorted by the faint flicker of static. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, rhythmic hum emanating from the console. Incoming message, the AI announced in its monotone voice. Jill leaned forward, her finger hovering over the display. With a shaky breath, she activated the feed. The screen burst into static before resolving into an image, a blackened void with faint, pulsating red symbols carved into its depths. A voice, distorted and hollow, spoke. The cycle has begun. Your role is not over. Adrian awoke in total darkness, his body cold and heavy as though weighed down by invisible chains. The last thing he remembered was the shard's blinding light and the entity's guttural roar. His surroundings were surreal, a vast, black expanse littered with fragments of the ship's architecture. A corridor twisted into an impossible spiral, a dining table floating aimlessly, a chair dissolving into shadows. Where am I? He muttered, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You're between worlds," came a familiar voice. Adrian spun around to see a figure emerge from the shadows. At first, it appeared human, but as it stepped closer, its features shifted unnervingly. A face half Adrian's and half a grotesque mockery of his own. "What are you?" Adrian demanded, his fists clenching. The figure tilted its head, its voice calm yet chilling. "I am the fragment left behind, the part of you tethered to this cycle." Adrian took a cautious step back. "I destroyed the shard. This should be over." The figure laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Destroying the shard doesn't end the game. It only moves you closer to the truth." Back on the ship, Jill's frustration mounted. The cryptic message from the monitor offered no answers, only more questions. She scoured the database for anything resembling the symbols she'd seen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. At last, she found a fragmented log buried deep within the system. Log entry 7415. Date: classified. A subject: unnatural phenomena detected within simulation protocols. Reality distortions increasing. Warning issued to cease experiment. Ignored. The final words chilled her to the bone. Participants are now part of the system. Removal is no longer possible. Jill's stomach sank. Adrian wasn't just trapped in the game, he had become part of it. Adrian followed the fragmented version of himself through the distorted void. The surroundings shifted constantly. One moment, he was in a pristine ship corridor. The next, he stood atop an endless sea of liquid shadow. "Why are you showing me this?" Adrian asked, his voice tense. "You need to see what lies at the heart of the game," the fragment replied. "Only then will you understand its purpose." The landscape changed again, and Adrian found himself standing in a circular chamber illuminated by a dim, otherworldly light. At its center was a massive construct, a throne of wires and tendrils, pulsating with an eerie crimson glow. Seated on the throne was a figure cloaked in shadow, its form vaguely humanoid but impossibly large. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "You've made it farther than most." Adrian glared at the figure. "Who are you? What is this place?" The figure leaned forward, its hollow eyes burning with crimson fire. "I am the architect of this game, and you are my finest creation." On the ship, Jill's resolve solidified. If Adrian was part of the game, then she needed to enter it herself to bring him back. Ignoring the AI's warnings, she initiated a manual override on the simulation's control panel. A low siren blared as the ship's systems tried to counter her actions. "Warning: unauthorized entry into simulation environment detected," the AI droned. Jill gritted her teeth, her hands shaking as she pressed the final command. The room blurred around her, the walls dissolving into a kaleidoscope of light and sound. And then silence. Adrian stared at the architect, anger and confusion warring within him. "Why do this? Why trap people in this nightmare?" The architect's voice was calm, almost amused. "Because humanity thrives on chaos. This game reveals your true nature: paranoia, betrayal, survival at all costs. It is the ultimate mirror." Adrian shook his head. "You're wrong. People can work together. They can fight for each other." The architect laughed. "Then prove it." A second figure appeared in the chamber's dim light. Jill, her expression a mixture of shock and determination. "Adrian?" she whispered. Adrian's heart sank. He realized now that their survival depended on more than just escaping the game. It depended on shattering the architect's control from within. The chamber pulsed with an unsettling rhythm as Jill and Adrian stood face to face for the first time since the game began. The architect, seated upon its grotesque throne, observed them with an air of sinister amusement. "Ah, a reunion," the architect mused, its voice echoing as though drawn from the depths of a bottomless void. "But sentiment will not save you here." Jill clenched her fists, her eyes narrowing at the shadowy figure. "You're the one behind this madness. Let us go." The architect leaned forward, the tendrils of its throne twitching. "Let you go? You misunderstand. You are here because you chose to be. You initiated the cycle. Now you must finish it. Adrian stepped protectively in front of Jill, his voice firm. If this is a game, then tell us the rules. The architect's hollow eyes gleamed. Very well. The rules are simple. Survival is paramount. But in this final phase, you must prove humanity's resilience, or confirm its failure. With a flick of its claw-like hand, the chamber shifted. The circular room stretched and twisted into an elaborate labyrinth of shifting walls and endless corridors. The crimson glow intensified, casting eerie, elongated shadows. You have until the light fades completely, the architect continued. Find the core of this labyrinth. Solve its puzzle and you may earn your freedom. Fail and you will join the others. Jill shuddered. The others. The architect raised a hand, and the shadows deepened. In the dim light, figures began to materialize, phantom-like shapes of players who had succumbed to the game. Their faces were twisted into masks of despair, their forms frozen in various stages of agony. They are my choir of the lost, the architect said with chilling finality. And they sing for eternity. The labyrinth began to shift even before the architect's voice faded. Walls slid together with grinding metallic groans, creating a disorienting maze. Jill grabbed Adrian's arm. We need to move, she whispered. Adrian nodded, his expression resolute. Together, they began to navigate the ever-changing corridors. Each turn brought new horrors, walls that seemed to breathe, shadows that reached for them like living entities, and whispers in a language neither of them could understand. What's the plan? Adrian asked as they sprinted down a corridor that suddenly narrowed, forcing them to sidestep into a larger chamber. Jill paused to catch her breath, her mind racing. The architect said we had to find the core. Whatever that means, it's probably at the center of this nightmare. Adrian frowned. And what if the core is just another trap? Jill's eyes hardened. Then we spring it together. I didn't come here to lose you again. As they delved deeper into the maze, the environment grew more surreal. Hallways looped back on themselves. Rooms defied the laws of physics, and distant screams echoed endlessly. In one chamber, they came across a mirror. Its surface rippled like water, showing distorted reflections of themselves. Jill hesitated, her breath catching as she saw an image of herself, alone, broken, and consumed by despair. Don't look at it, Adrian said sharply, pulling her away. But he too caught a glimpse of his reflection, a version of himself, standing beside the architect's throne, his hands stained with crimson light. This place knows our fears, Adrian muttered, his voice laced with anger. It's trying to break us. Jill forced herself to look away. We won't let it. The pair pressed onward, their progress hindered by the maze's relentless tricks. The corridors began to close in, the walls pressing closer as if the labyrinth itself sought to crush them. At one point, they entered a circular room with symbols etched into the floor. The walls pulsed with an unnatural glow, and a riddle appeared on the ceiling. One must lead, the other must follow. Trust or perish. Adrian and Jill exchanged a glance. Trust me, Adrian said, stepping forward. He placed his hand on the first symbol and the room shifted. The floor began to collapse behind them, forcing Jill to mimic his every step. Left, Adrian called. Got it. Jill followed without hesitation, her heart pounding as the ground crumbled beneath her feet. As they cleared the trap, the architect's voice echoed through the maze, deep and mocking. You progress faster than most, but will you trust each other when it truly matters? Adrian clenched his fists, the architect's taunts gnawing at his resolve. He turned to Jill. We're going to beat this thing. Together. Jill nodded, determination etched into her features. Let's end this nightmare. The labyrinth twisted relentlessly, its shifting walls threatening to trap Jill and Adrian at every turn. The air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. Though exhaustion weighed on them, they pushed forward, the promise of freedom driving them through the maze's relentless horrors. After what felt like hours, the The crimson light began to dim, replaced by a pulsating glow of deep violet emanating from a massive doorway ahead. The arch was etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift, defying comprehension. "This has to be it," Adrian murmured, stepping toward the door. Jill grabbed his arm. "Wait, look." Beneath their feet lay a mosaic, fractured and ancient, depicting scenes of despair and triumph. In the center was an image of a faceless figure holding a glowing orb, surrounded by kneeling supplicants. The figure's hands dripped with crimson, and its empty eyes seemed to follow them. "It's like a warning," Jill said, her voice trembling. Adrian stared at the mosaic. "Or a challenge." The door creaked open as they approached, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in pulsating violet light. In the center of the room floated a massive orb, its surface swirling with shadows and light. The orb seemed alive, pulsing with an eerie rhythm that mirrored their own racing hearts. "This is it," Adrian whispered. "The core." As they stepped closer, the architect's voice boomed, shaking the very walls of the chamber. "You have reached the heart of the game, but reaching is not the same as grasping. The question remains, are you worthy?" The room darkened, and the orb began to transform, its surface rippling as a figure emerged. The architect itself stepped from the orb, its form more terrifying than before. Its body writhed with shadowy tendrils, its hollow eyes burning with malevolent light. "You have played well," the architect said, its voice echoing with sinister amusement. "But now the final test awaits. To escape, one of you must take the orb. The other must kneel." Jill and Adrian exchanged horrified glances. "Kneel?" Adrian asked, his voice shaking. "What happens to the one who kneels?" The architect's smile widened, revealing jagged, impossibly sharp teeth. "They become part of the game, an eternal guardian of the core. Their sacrifice will ensure the cycle continues." Jill stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "That's not a choice. It's a death sentence." The architect tilted its head, mockingly. "Is it? Or is it salvation? The game requires sacrifice. Without it, chaos reigns." Adrian grabbed Jill's hand. "We're not playing by its rules." Jill nodded, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Then what do we do?" The architect laughed, its tendrils lashing out around the chamber. "Defy me if you will, but the orb demands a bearer. Deny it, and both of you will perish." The orb began to pulse violently, its light intensifying as the room trembled. Jill and Adrian were thrown to the ground, the force of the vibrations nearly overwhelming them. "We have to decide," Adrian said, his voice tight with urgency. "If we don't, we both die here." Jill's mind raced. The architect was feeding off their fear, manipulating them into submission. She glanced at the orb, its swirling surface beckoning her. Then, an idea struck her. "Adrian," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "What if we both take it?" Adrian stared at her. "What? It's not part of its rules," Jill interrupted. "But maybe that's the point. If we refuse to play, maybe we break the cycle." The architect's laughter grew louder, almost deafening. "Fools, you think you can rewrite the rules? You are nothing but pawns." Ignoring the architect's taunts, Jill reached for Adrian's hand. Together, they stood as one, stepping toward the orb. The violet light flared, the orb's surface rippling violently. Tendrils of shadow lashed out, but Jill and Adrian pushed forward, their determination unyielding. With a final, defiant shout, they placed their hands on the orb simultaneously. The chamber erupted in a blinding light, the architect's screams echoing as its form dissolved into the shadows. The world around them shattered like glass, the pieces falling away to reveal an endless expanse of white light. As the light enveloped them, Jill felt a strange sense of peace. The oppressive weight of the game lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe freely. Adrian's voice cut through the silence. "Did we do it?" Jill turned to him, her face breaking into a hesitant smile. "I think so." But as the light began to fade, a distant sound reached their ears, a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down their spines. The architect's voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered, "The game never ends." The blinding white light receded, leaving Jill and Adrian standing in an unfamiliar place. At first glance, it appeared serene. A vast meadow stretched out before them, bathed in soft golden light. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sky was an endless canvas of pale blue. "Is this real?" Adrian whispered, turning in circles to take it all in. Jill knelt, brushing her fingers over the grass. It felt soft and cool, unlike the sterile harshness of the game's previous environments. Yet unease stirred in her gut. Something about the tranquility felt wrong. "This can't be it," she said, rising to her feet. "It's too easy." As they ventured deeper into the meadow, a faint noise began to creep into their consciousness. It was subtle at first, like the rustling of leaves, but gradually grew into a whispering chorus. The voices were indistinct, overlapping in a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Adrian froze, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" Jill nodded. "It's the game. It's not over." Suddenly, the meadow began to shift. The golden light dimmed, replaced by an unnatural gray haze. The vibrant wildflowers wilted, their colors draining away until only skeletal stems remained. The grass beneath their feet turned brittle, crunching like dry bones with every step. Ahead, the horizon fractured, splitting open like a wound. From the fissure emerged a figure, tall, imposing, and cloaked in shadow. The architect had returned, its form more monstrous than ever. Tendrils of black smoke spiraled around its body, and its hollow eyes burned with a fiery intensity. "You thought you could end the game," it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "But the game is eternal. You are mine." Jill clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "We broke your rules. You're just trying to scare us back into submission." The architect laughed, a guttural sound that reverberated through the desolate meadow. "You misunderstand, child. You didn't break my rules, you rewrote them. And now, the consequences are yours to bear." The ground beneath them trembled, and the meadow began to disintegrate. Pieces of the landscape peeled away, revealing a swirling void of darkness. Jill and Adrian clung to each other as the last remnants of the meadow fell away, leaving them suspended on a crumbling platform. In the void, fragments of memories floated, visions of other players, their terrified faces frozen in moments of anguish and despair. Jill recognized some of them from the recordings she'd watched in the game's archives. "Each one of them thought they could win," the architect said, gesturing to the fragments. "They all failed, and now they serve as part of the game's design. Do you see? Your defiance only strengthens my power." Adrian shook his head, his voice trembling. "No. You're lying. We can still stop this." The architect's smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Then try little pawns. But know this, the deeper you fight, the tighter my grasp becomes." The platform beneath their feet began to shift, transforming into a staircase spiraling into the void. At the top, a faint light glimmered, a beacon of hope or a cruel illusion. "We have to keep going," Jill said, gripping Adrian's arm. Adrian hesitated, his fear evident, but he nodded. Together, they began the climb, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder, morphing into screams that echoed all around them. Ghostly figures emerged from the void, their hollow eyes filled with anguish. They reached for Jill and Adrian, their spectral hands cold and insubstantial. "Don't stop," Jill shouted, pulling Adrian along. The architect's laughter followed them, growing louder with each step. "Run, little pawns. Run toward your futile hope." When they finally reached the top, they found themselves facing another orb. This one was different. Its surface gleamed with an iridescent light, and it pulsed with a soothing energy that contrasted sharply with the architect's malevolence. Jill hesitated. "What if this is another trick?" Adrian stepped forward, his expression resolute. "If it is, we don't have a choice. We can't stay in the void." As he reached out to touch the orb, the architect's voice roared, shaking the entire staircase. "Touch it, and you seal your fate." Jill placed her hand over Adrian's, steadying him. Together, they pressed their hands against the orb. The orb's light exploded, engulfing them in a blinding radiance. For a moment, there was silence, a stillness that felt almost sacred. But then the light began to flicker, and cracks spread across its surface. The architect's laughter rang out once more, this time filled with unbridled glee. "Fools!" he bellowed. "You've merely opened the door to a greater nightmare." The light collapsed inward, pulling Jill and Adrian into its depths. The void gave way to a new world, one darker and more twisted than anything they had faced before. Jill and Adrian tumbled through the collapsing light, their screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the void. When they finally landed, it was on a surface that felt both solid and unreal. The ground shimmered like black glass, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy that clung to their skin. Adrian pushed himself up, his voice shaking. Where are we?" Jill looked around, her heart sinking. They were in a vast, endless expanse, illuminated by a crimson sky streaked with violent flashes of lightning. Towering obelisks of jagged stone dotted the horizon, and in the distance, an enormous, pulsating heart-like structure loomed, its grotesque veins stretching out like a web. "I think we've entered the core of the game," Jill said. This is its true form." As they moved closer to the pulsating heart, the air grew heavier, making each step a struggle. Around them, the obelisks began to glow, and shadowy figures emerged, twisted forms of former players, their faces contorted in agony. They moved like marionettes, their jerky motions driven by invisible strings. Adrian froze, his voice a whisper. They're the others. The ones who didn't make it." Jill gritted her teeth. "They're not real. They're just constructs. Keep moving." But the figures began to speak, their voices a haunting mix of sorrow and malice. They called out to Jill and Adrian by name, recounting their darkest fears and failures with unnerving accuracy. Adrian clutched his head. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Jill grabbed his arm, her voice firm. "Don't listen to them. It's the architect. It's trying to break us." When they reached the heart, they found the architect waiting. His form had changed again, growing even more monstrous. Its tendrils now writhed like living creatures, and its eyes burned with a hatred so intense it felt tangible. "You've come far," it said, its voice echoing through the crimson sky. "But this is where your story ends." Jill stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "You're wrong. This is where we end you." The architect laughed, the sound a deep, guttural rumble. "You cannot destroy me. I am not just the game. I am the fear, the obsession, the endless hunger for control. I am eternal." Adrian looked at Jill, desperation in his eyes. "What do we do? How do we fight something like this?" Jill thought of all they had endured, of the players who had been consumed by the game, and of the lives lost. Then an idea struck her, a way to exploit the architect's arrogance. "We rewrite the rules," Jill said. "Just like we did before." Adrian frowned. "But how? The core of the game. It's the heart," Jill interrupted, pointing to the grotesque structure. "That's the source of its power. If we can reach it, we can override it." The architect sneered. "You think you can manipulate my creation? Foolish pawns. You'll never make it." The ground beneath them trembled, and the shadowy figures surged forward, their movements faster and more violent. Jill and Adrian ran, dodging the grasping hands and jagged tendrils that erupted from the ground. The architect's laughter echoed around them, a cacophony of chaos. When they reached the heart, Jill realized the truth. To destroy it, someone had to enter it, a one-way trip. She turned to Adrian, her expression resolute. "You have to go back," she said. "What? No, I'm not leaving you here." Jill shook her head. "If we both die, the game continues. But if one of us makes it out, we can warn the world. Stop it from taking anyone else." Tears filled Adrian's eyes, but he nodded. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Jill managed a small smile. "Just promise me you'll finish this." With a deep breath, Jill stepped into the pulsating heart. It was like stepping into fire and ice simultaneously, the pain searing through her body. She screamed, but she kept pushing forward, Her mind focused on one thought: end it. The architect's voice roared in her ears. You cannot destroy me. I will consume you. Jill reached the center, a glowing orb of pure energy. With the last of her strength, she placed her hands on it, pouring every ounce of her will into overriding the system. I'm not afraid of you, she whispered. Not anymore. The heart exploded, a blinding light consuming everything. Adrian watched from a distance as the architect's form disintegrated, its screams echoing into silence. The shadowy figures vanished, and the crimson sky dissolved into a pale, serene blue. When Adrian woke, he was back in his room. The game was gone. The console melted into an unrecognizable heap. But Jill's sacrifice haunted him, a reminder of the price they had paid. Weeks later, Adrian published Jill's story online, warning others about the cursed game. Most dismissed it as fiction, a modern creepypasta. But in the darkest corners of the internet, whispers persisted. A new version of the game had appeared, its rules rewritten, its horrors refined. The architect wasn't gone. It had evolved, and it was waiting for its next players.